The bedspread at number 6, Willow Lane. The secret buried beneath her pillow. Inspector Pubright. The town of Flaxborough possessed the special sort of calm that appears in market towns which have very little to be excited about, and even less inclination to change that fact. Its high street, proud, if prematurely so, stretched like an elderly cat before a fire, all tidy windows, immobile lace curtains, and shopkeepers who kept their greetings honed to a predictable half-smile. On most mornings the loudest sound was the milkman explaining to himself why he should not increase his prices. On this particular morning, however, a small agitation had unsettled the quiet. It began at precisely 27 minutes past 7, which was when Mrs. Adeline Brotherton of number 6 Willow Lane stepped out of her doorway wearing an expression usually reserved for funerals and council budget meetings. This was notable only because Mrs. Brotherton had attended 3 funerals and 8 council meetings this month alone, and had shown less distress at all of them combined. Her short, firm walk down the lane brought her to the police station, where she paused only long enough to tut at the dust collecting on the station's window ledges. She considered knocking with a degree of ceremony, but the door was ajar, and so she simply marched through. Constable Malley was the first to see her. He instinctively straightened, as if afraid she might conduct an inspection of his posture. "Good morning, Mrs. Brotherton," he attempted. "It is not," she replied, and continued past him like a guided missile toward the inspector's office. Inspector Pubright looked up from a file that dealt with a dispute over rabbit hutches. He regarded Mrs. Brotherton with his customary mildness, the same expression he might have given a hesitant sparrow on his window-sill. "Mrs. Brotherton, you seem troubled." "Inspector, I'm afraid I must report an incident of a most distressing nature," she announced, lowering herself into the chair as though it were an act of considerable courage. Pubright folded his hands and waited. He had learned long ago that interruptions only inflated the drama. "It concerns my late sister," she continued. "You will recall that she passed away 4 days ago." "Peacefully," they said. "Peacefully," a word that feels rather misplaced now. Pubright murmured something sympathetic. Mrs. Brotherton leaned forward. "Inspector, someone has been in her bedroom." Purbright's eyebrows lifted just slightly, enough to show attention, not enough to suggest alarm. "In what sense, Mrs. Brotherton?" She removed a small handkerchief from her handbag and held it delicately to her chin, as if steadying herself. "I went yesterday evening to gather a few of her personal items. Her pillows were precisely how I left them after the funeral arrangements, flattened properly. My sister always appreciated correct flattening. But last night, when I returned to collect her jewellery, I discovered one pillow had been lifted. Something had been tucked beneath it." "Something?" Pubright repeated, pleasantly vague. "A fabric object," she whispered, as though scandalized by its very existence. "Inspector, I did not put it there. No one else had permission to enter her room, and yet there it was, like a—" She paused, groping for a word. "Like an intrusion." "May I ask what the object was?" Mrs. Brotherton hesitated. "A scrap of embroidered cloth, childish embroidery, not my sister's, not mine, not from anywhere in the house." "Embroidery?" Pubright echoed with slow curiosity. "Of a name, perhaps?" "No," she said sharply, then softened. "A pattern?" "Small roses, very small. The sort stitched on baby garments, if I am not mistaken." Pubright allowed a gentle pause. "And this worries you because—" She stiffened. "Because, Inspector, my sister had no children, none at all, and she would have sooner swallowed a thistle than embroider anything sentimental." Pubright observed the faint tremor in her gloved hands. Behind the controlled formality, something deeper stirred, not fear of burglary, but fear of discovery. He made no comment. "Did you remove the object?" he asked instead. "I did," she admitted after a delay. "It is in my handbag now." She placed the bag on his desk with the carefulness one usually reserved for relics or explosives. Pubright opened it with polite caution. Inside lay a folded scrap of off-white cloth, the embroidery faded but careful. A faint scent clung to it, lavender perhaps, though there was something else beneath, a note not easily named. "It was beneath her pillow?" he asked. "Yes." "Had anyone else stayed in the house recently?" "No, my sister lived alone except for the occasional lodger, but she had none in the past month." Pubright nodded slowly. "And you are certain the pillow was undisturbed when you last left?" "Inspector," she said, in a tone typically reserved for disappointing schoolchildren, "I know the difference between a pillow that has been interfered with and one that has not." He smiled faintly. "Of course," she pressed on. "Someone entered that room with purpose. Someone placed that cloth beneath the pillow intentionally. And I firmly believe," she added, lowering her voice to a theatrical hush, "that the object is meant to convey something. What might it convey, do you think?" "I cannot say," she replied stiffly, which was Purbright's first indication that she could indeed say something, but had chosen not to. Outside, Constable Malley pretended not to listen. Pubright, meanwhile, lifted the cloth and turned it toward the light. It was small enough to have come from a sleeve cuff or the corner of a child's smock. The stitches were careful but old. Whoever had made them had done so with affection. "I see no immediate sign of wrongdoing," Pubright said mildly, "but it is certainly curious." "Curious?" Mrs. Brotherton exclaimed softly. "Inspector, if you knew my sister, you would know she despised curiosities. Anything puzzling was either thrown away or returned to sender." Pubright replaced the cloth in her handbag. "I shall make some discreet inquiries," he said. "No need to alarm anyone." Mrs. Brotherton rose with military precision. "I trust you will, Inspector. My family has maintained a spotless reputation in Flaxborough for decades. I will not have it stained by mysterious artifacts." She marched out. Pubright leaned back, eyes narrowed in reflective amusement. It was, he thought, a remarkable start to the day. A suspicious pillow, a secret scrap of embroidery, and a woman who feared reputation more than robbery. He suspected, though he kept the thought quiet even from himself, that the cloth had not been left by accident, and that it was less a message to Mrs. Brotherton than a message from someone her sister had never dared to acknowledge. Somewhere in Flaxborough, someone was already worried that the police might look too closely, and Pubright intended to do exactly that. Flaxborough absorbed the news of Mrs. Brotherton's visit to the police station with the efficiency of a sponge in a shallow basin. By mid-morning, long before Inspector Pubright had finished considering what, if anything, he ought to do about the embroidered scrap, the town had already determined 3 alternate versions of the event and was well on its way to drafting a 4th. None resembled the truth, of course. Flaxborough gossip seldom troubled itself with accuracy when embroidery, deathbeds, or sisters were involved. The first deviation occurred at Miss Pulteney's hairdressing salon, where Mrs. Brotherton had stopped on her return home to make an entirely unrelated inquiry about next week's appointment. She had said nothing, a silence she considered virtuous, but her tightened lips and slightly compressed nostrils were enough for Miss Pulteney to conclude that something mortifying had happened at the station. Mortifying quickly evolved into shocking, then scandalous, and by the time Mrs. Brotherton left with her dignity tightly wrapped around her, like a winter scarf, Miss Pulteney felt she had moral grounds to share the matter for the sake of community harmony. She confided first in Mrs. Harmstone, who arrived for a trim, already distraught about the rising cost of raisins. Mrs. Harmston, who possessed an imagination easily startled into activity, interpreted the hints to mean that something had been discovered under the dead woman's pillow. Although Miss Pulteney had said no such thing, she did not contradict the idea. She merely added that Mrs. Brotherton's expression had been quite strained. From there the rumour was born as naturally as a weed in an unweeded garden. By noon, the bakery queue crackled with speculation. Mr. Daggett, who served pastries with the air of a man doing Flaxborough an immense favour, informed his customers that a letter of peculiar nature had been found, addressed, someone said, to a man with initials no one could quite hear. A man in line behind two school teachers declared that the letter was surely a confession, the sort elderly spinsters wrote when they foresaw themselves on the brink of death. The school teachers considered the idea melodramatic but satisfying, and added it to the story they passed on to their students later that day. In the Methodist church hall, where the ladies' tea committee arranged plates of biscuits for the upcoming charity sale, the embroidered scrap had transformed into a will, written in cipher. One woman insisted she had it on good authority that the will disinherited a relative, though she could not remember which, while another whispered that the cipher concealed a love affair. No one asked how a ciphered will could possibly relate to Mrs. Brotherton, but such practical concerns rarely troubled the tea committee. Inspector Pubright, meanwhile, remained unaware of most of these creative embellishments. He did hear something from Constable Malley, who sheepishly admitted that a butcher's assistant had asked whether the police were investigating the secret child. Pubright sighed, not with irritation, but with a weary recognition of the speed at which Flaxborough's imagination could outrun its legs. He tucked the embroidered scrap into a small envelope and slipped it into his drawer, though he could not resist one last glance at it. The faint lavender smell lingered, joined by a second, more elusive trace that reminded him, distantly, old wooden drawers and something misplaced within them. He made no conclusions. Conclusions, he had found, often ruined perfectly promising mysteries. What interested him more was Mrs. Brotherton's reaction. Her distress, though genuine in its way, had not been the distress of a woman frightened by crime. It had been the anxiety of someone who feared something being exposed. And she had been careful, almost too careful, to avoid speculation about the cloth's origin. She had spoken of reputation several times and of family spotless for decades. Pubright had heard that particular emphasis before. People with spotless reputations were rarely as spotless as they insisted. He stepped out of his office to stretch his legs, telling Malley he was going for a wander. This, in Flaxborough, was understood to be a form of unofficial information gathering far more productive than official interviews. His first stop was the High Street. He purchased a modest pork pie, mostly to encourage conversation, and paused outside the bakery. Mrs. Harmston was inside, selecting scones with the seriousness of a jeweller appraising diamonds. Pubright nodded politely to her. She flushed, uncertain whether she should apologize for the theory she had recently helped propagate or ask if the inspector needed assistance with his confession letter. He spared her the dilemma by moving on. At the corner near the post office, he encountered the vicar's assistant, young Mr. Chillingworth, a man who took his duties seriously despite possessing a face that looked permanently startled by the world. Chillingworth greeted him with a flustered enthusiasm. "Inspector, terrible business this. Terrible indeed." "Oh?" Pubright replied calmly. "Which business would that be?" "The matter with the pillow," Chillingworth said, lowering his voice as though respectful of pillows generally. "Mrs. Brotherton has suffered a shocking revelation. They're saying a message was left for her late sister, a moral one, perhaps a warning." Pubright nodded with gentle consideration. They, are they? Oh yes, Chillingworth continued, leaning closer. Some think it relates to an indiscretion in her youth, the sort of thing people didn't speak of in those days. Pubright refrained from pointing out that Chillingworth was speaking of it now with considerable relish. Instead, he asked, "Do you happen to know who visited Mrs. Brotherton's sister in her final days?" "Well, a few parishioners," Chillingworth said thoughtfully. "The lodger came by twice, and the neighbour, Mr. Hillingtree, visited more often. They say he was very attentive." Pubright thanked him and continued down the street. Mr. Hillingtree, a tidy, thin man with a tendency to complain about bin collection schedules, did not strike him as the embroidery type. But attentiveness to neighbours, especially female ones, always merited at least a moment's curiosity. By late afternoon, the rumour had evolved again. The grocer reported that the object under the pillow was not embroidered cloth, but a bundle of banknotes. The librarian said it was a list of enemies. A schoolboy claimed it was a map of buried treasure, though the boy had a long history of treasure maps and was unlikely to have any new information. Pubright returned to the station with the faint air of a man carrying more thoughts than groceries. He placed the pie on his desk and regarded the envelope containing the embroidered scrap. Whatever its meaning, it had stirred something in Mrs. Brotherton stronger than grief. And the town's chatter, though mostly useless, had revealed one useful thread. Several people had reasons to visit the deceased in her final days, but only one person had not been mentioned at all: the niece. Mrs. Brotherton had never spoken of her, not once during the morning's conversation. That absence felt odd, as if someone had carefully swept around a particular fact and hoped no one would notice the clean patch. Pubright leaned back, steepling his fingers. The town would keep chattering, inventing stories from thin air. But he preferred the ones people tried to keep hidden, the ones only visible by their absence. And somewhere behind all the embroidered fantasies and whispered theories, the truth was quietly waiting to be noticed. Inspector Pubright began his inquiries the following morning with the calm steadiness of a man taking a constitutional stroll rather than investigating a potentially delicate matter. The embroidered scrap lay safely in his drawer, but the scent of it, lavender, edged with something older, woodier, seemed to linger in his thoughts. The rumours of Flaxborough had grown overnight like mushrooms after damp weather, yet none had touched upon the thing that interested him. The faint tension in Mrs. Brotherton's voice when she denied any knowledge of the cloth's origin. That tension, polite as it was, had held something more brittle beneath. He decided to begin with someone who would certainly have an opinion about everything, Mr. Hillingtree, the deceased woman's neighbour. The man answered his door with the wary politeness of someone accustomed to finding charity collectors or cousins seeking loans on his doorstep. His long, narrow face stretched into an expression intended to appear welcoming, though it conveyed mostly surprise. "Inspector Pubright? I suppose this is about poor Miss Latterly? A most sorrowful business indeed." Pubright offered a gentle nod. "I wondered if you might spare a few minutes to discuss her final days. You visited her quite often, I understand." "Visits?" Hillingtree blinked. "Oh, well, yes, strictly neighbourly, of course. One must look out for those who live alone. She seemed rather frail." "Frail in body or spirit?" Pubright asked with mild curiosity. Hillingtree hesitated, fingers tightening on the door edge. "Both, perhaps," she worried easily. "Made mountains out of mole hills, if you understand." Pubright understood very well. People who made mountains out of mole hills often did so because the real mountain lay somewhere else entirely. He stepped inside when invited, accepting a seat in a room set with such rigid precision that one might assume guests were expected to levitate above the furniture rather than risk wrinkling it. "You mentioned she worried," Pubright said. "Did she confide anything recently?" "Well," Hillingtree shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. "She said something odd the night before she died. I dismissed it naturally." "Odd in what way?" "That someone had been in her room." He swallowed. "She said she felt it. A presence, she called it. I told her it was nothing. A draught, perhaps. But she insisted someone had moved something on her pillow." Purbright's brows lifted slightly. "Moved something?" "Yes. I assumed she meant her glasses or her hairpins. She had such notions, you know. Said she heard footsteps at night when there were only the radiators settling." Pubright thanked him, noting the faint tremor in the man's fingers. It wasn't fear of Miss Latterly's ghost, it was fear of saying too much, and that fear, polite as it tried to be, suggested he had seen or heard more than he wished to admit. When Pubright stepped back into Willow Lane, he saw a figure approaching at an efficient pace, a young woman with a firm stride and the expression of someone accustomed to completing tasks quickly and without fuss. She wore the plain clothing of a housekeeper and carried a shopping bag so full it seemed to threaten mutiny. "Miss Woodbriar," Pubright greeted her, recognizing her as the late woman's long-time housekeeper. She blinked, startled, then dipped her head in a stiff greeting. "Inspector, I was just taking some things to the vicarage as requested. I'd appreciate a word, if you're able." She hesitated. A brief, flickering moment that suggested reluctance, but nodded. "Very well, sir." He walked beside her, allowing her pace to set the rhythm. "You were close to Miss Latterly," Pubright said. Miss Woodbriar's lips thinned slightly. "Close? In service, yes. Close in affection? I wouldn't say that. She was not an easy woman to be affectionate with." "But you cared for her?" "I cared for her household," she corrected. "Which is more than most did." Pubright let that float a moment. "Did she seem troubled recently?" Miss Woodbriar's hand tightened on the bag. She'd been unsettled, kept checking drawers, hiding things inside books, that sort of behavior. "Did she say why?" "She didn't explain herself to me," the housekeeper replied, though the defensiveness in her voice hinted that explanations had indeed been offered, ones she did not wish to repeat. "And on the night before her death?" Pubright asked casually. Miss Woodbriar's steps faltered. "She dismissed me early. Said she had someone coming, but wouldn't say who." Pubright regarded her mildly. "Someone? A visitor?" "I assumed so, but when I returned the next morning, the house was quiet. Too quiet. And she looked tired, as if she'd been crying." Pubright thanked her, and Miss Woodbriar made a swift retreat, disappearing around the corner with the relief of someone escaping a draughty room. He made his way next to the vicarage, where the vicar's assistant, young Mr. Chillingworth, awaited him with an expression of earnest distress. The poor fellow seemed to have accumulated more concern in the past 12 hours than most people managed in a month. "Inspector, I hope I can be of help. You mentioned yesterday that several parishioners visited Miss Latterly near the end," Pubright said. "Do you recall if anyone came on the evening before she died?" Chillingworth pressed his lips together, thinking hard. "I believe. Yes, her niece. She attended briefly. They spoke in the parlour. Miss Latterly insisted on privacy." Pubright leaned in slightly. "Her niece? I had not heard she visited." "I suppose few knew. Mrs. Brotherton doesn't speak of her much. They've never been close, you understand. A family disagreement, or several of them." Pubright nodded thoughtfully. the absence of mention once again. "And what is the niece's character like?" he asked. Chillingworth fumbled for words. "Cheerful on the surface. Very cheerful. Almost too cheerful, in that way people are when they're determined not to acknowledge something painful." Pubright let the remark settle. When people refused to acknowledge something painful, it was usually because that something had a way of surfacing at inconvenient times. He took a slow walk back toward the station. The morning enquiries had revealed 3 things. Miss Latterly believed someone had been in her room before her death. Several people knew of her unease but said little, and the niece, conspicuously unmentioned by Mrs. Brotherton, had visited her aunt privately the evening before she died. The embroidered scrap, tucked beneath the pillow, felt less like an intrusion now and more like a message that had miscarried on its way to the intended recipient. And Mrs. Brotherton's fear had deepened in Pirbright's memory. It was not fear of crime, but fear of old truth resurfacing. Back in his office, he retrieved the envelope and studied the cloth again. The tiny roses were stitched with a loving hand, not the hurriedness of necessity. The scent remained, lavender and something else. Wood smoke, cedar, something tied to a drawer long shut. A knock at the door drew him from these thoughts. Constable Malley stepped in. "Sir, Mrs. Brotherton is here again?" Pirbright nodded. "Show her in." Mrs. Brotherton entered with her posture even stiffer than before. Her eyes darted to the envelope on his desk, then away. "Inspector, I have remembered something," she announced, though she looked more as though she had decided to forget it until she found she could not. "I'm listening." "The cloth," she said, lowering her voice. "It resembles something from many years ago, something from a time we do not discuss." Pirbright folded his hands. "We?" "My sister and I," she snapped softly. Then after a breath, "There were matters, personal ones, family ones, best left in the past." "Yet the past seldom stays where we put it," Pirbright replied gently, her lips compressed. "Inspector, I want to be perfectly clear. Whatever people are saying in town, the truth is not what they imagine, and I will not have our name dragged into gossip because of some foolish scrap of old fabric." She paused, eyes flaring briefly with something rawer than propriety. "It is best," she said stiffly, "not to dig." But Pirbright only inclined his head, polite and unreadable, because, of course, he intended to dig precisely where she wished he wouldn't. Mrs. Brotherton's warning lingered in the room long after she had departed, leaving behind an air of brittle respectability and the faint scent of lavender soap. Pirbright watched the door close behind her with the calm attention of a man noting the final movement in a stage performance whose earlier acts he had already suspected. "Best not to dig," she had said. Naturally, it meant precisely the opposite, but in Flaxborough very little could be left to rest once the town had sniffed the faintest possibility of intrigue. And if Pirbright had not yet dug, the councillors were more than ready to start. He found Councillor Edwin Peel waiting for him scarcely an hour later, the man having arrived with all the ceremony of a dignitary attending an inspection. Peel swept into the office with the pink-cheeked urgency of someone who enjoyed crises, provided they belonged to other people. "Inspector Pubright," Peel began, lowering himself heavily into the offered chair, "I trust you are investigating the matter with the utmost seriousness." Pubright folded his hands. "Which matter might that be, Councillor?" Peel sniffed significantly. "The business with Miss Latterly's pillow, of course. There are rumours, Inspector, rumours of items being found." He cleared his throat. "Messages, symbols possibly connected to criminal behaviour." "I was not aware embroidered roses constituted criminal behaviour," Pubright replied mildly. Peel's eyebrows rose. "Ah, so it is embroidery. Well, then you must surely be considering the obvious suspect." Pubright waited, expression pleasantly blank. "The nephew," Peel said, as though unveiling something brilliant. "Leonard Latterly, a thoroughly unreliable young man, known among the town committee members for flights of fancy, poor money habits, and—" His voice dropped. "Moral laxity." "I see," Pubright murmured. "And what evidence leads you to suspect Mr. Leonard Latterly embroidering baby garments under his aunt's pillow?" Peel frowned, missing the irony entirely. "Evidence? Well, none in the sense you refer to, but the young man needs money, and where there is inheritance there is motive. Need I say more?" "Not at all," Pubright replied, though privately he thought Peel had already said rather too much. The councillor pressed on, emboldened. "He was seen near Willow Lane the evening before the death, and he has not presented himself to offer condolences at any town committee gatherings. Shabby behaviour, if you ask me." Pubright did not ask him, but Peel answered anyway. "He is your suspect, Inspector. Mark my words, it is always the financially desperate one." "Always?" Pubright echoed. Peel nodded with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong in his own mind. "Always." When the councillor finally departed, leaving a trail of certainty behind him like cigar smoke, Pubright allowed himself a very small smile. Convenient suspects were useful only insofar as they highlighted where not to look. Still, he felt obliged, if only to satisfy the councillor's appetite, to speak to Leonard. He found the young man at the small, cluttered boarding room he rented above a newsagent's shop. Leonard opened the door, wearing a shirt with buttons that did not agree on their alignment, and an expression suggesting he expected the worst, but hoped it might yet be an overreaction. "Inspector Pubright?" he asked nervously. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," Pubright said kindly. "I wish to ask you about your aunt." Leonard's shoulders sagged. "Oh, yes, poor Aunt Prudence. I'm afraid I wasn't much of a comfort in her final years. I haven't been very useful to anyone lately." "Mrs. Brotherton didn't mention you had visited your aunt in the days before her passing," Pubright said casually. Leonard blinked in confusion. "Visited her? I didn't. I haven't been to Willow Lane in months." Pubright regarded him steadily. "Not even the evening before she died?" "No," Leonard said, startled. "I was working that night, or attempting to, at the filling station. They let me sweep the forecourt for some extra cash." He reddened slightly. "My cousin, Mrs. Brotherton's son, said I ought to pull myself together." Pubright made a note, mental, not written. "Your aunt, did she ever speak of visitors, or express unease?" "She always seemed uneasy," Leonard admitted. "But she was kind, much kinder than Aunt Adeline. She used to hide sweets in her writing desk for me when I was little." That tugged something faint in Purbright's memory, the scent on the cloth. Not sweets, but something that belonged in childhood spaces, something small and tucked away. Leonard wiped his palms on his trousers. "But if something's happened, Inspector, I want to help. Truly, my aunt didn't deserve trouble." Pubright rose gently. "There has been no crime established, merely questions." Leonard nodded, though worry shadowed his features as Pubright left. On his walk back toward the station, Pubright passed the Latterly house again. The curtains were partly drawn, as though the building itself wished to keep its secrets tucked safely inside. A faint draught rustled the front hedge. Someone was watching from behind the lace. Miss Woodbriar, the housekeeper, appeared at the gate, arms folded. "Inspector?" "Miss Woodbriar." "You've spoken to Mr. Leonard," she said, not a question, but a statement sharpened with disapproval. "He doesn't know anything." "I like to hear such things for myself," Pubright replied. He was never close to Miss Latterly, not like some people. There was a challenge in her voice, one she did not elaborate upon. And Mrs. Brotherton is very upset. She thinks you're looking in the wrong direction. Pubright tilted his head. Do you think I'm looking in the wrong direction? Miss, Woodbriar hesitated. I think people should let the dead rest. Pubright watched her closely. Resting is easier when the living speak plainly. She stiffened. Some things don't need to be spoken, especially old things. And yet, Pubright said gently, they have a way of resurfacing, often in unexpected places. Miss Woodbriar looked sharply toward the window. For a moment, Pubright wondered if she might reveal her thoughts, but instead she clutched her arms tighter and retreated into the house. The convenient culprit, Leonard, was dissolving rapidly. If anything, his timidity and transparent worry had made him less plausible than before. Peel's certainty was not shared by Pubright. Certainty in Flaxborough was usually the mark of someone whose understanding began and ended with appearances. Returning to the station, Pubright sat down and removed the envelope from his drawer once more. The cloth lay inside, waiting. He lifted it, inhaling faintly. Lavender, yes, but also that elusive second scent, the one that hinted at drawers long closed and memories sealed within them. Not the smell of a young man desperate for inheritance, not the smell of a counsellor's convenient theory, not the smell of a harmless curiosity, but the smell of something old, something someone had long feared would come to light. Pubright placed the cloth on his desk with careful fingers. One question remained louder than the others. Who wanted the past to stay buried? As he stared at the delicate embroidered roses, he felt the quiet certainty that the cloth had been placed with intention, an intention not of theft nor inheritance, but perhaps of revelation. And the person most frightened by revelations had made herself abundantly known. Inspector Pubright spent a curiously long time studying the embroidered scrap that afternoon. It lay on his desk like a meek witness, silent, harmless, and yet somehow more eloquent than any of the conversations he had endured over the past 2 days. The stitches were tidy but uneven in places, as though made by a beginner or by someone with a trembling hand. The roses were no larger than a fingernail, pink once, but faded now to the colour of old blush. What clung to it, stubborn as memory, was that scent he still couldn't quite place. Lavender certainly, but beneath it lingered something woody, faintly sweet and reminiscent of attics, where childhood things are boxed away and forgotten until someone dares to disturb the dust. He leaned back slightly. The cloth was too small to be a handkerchief and too carefully embroidered to be a household rag. Something intended for a baby, Miss Woodbriar had hinted without meaning to. Something sentimental. Something Miss Latterly, the strict, unsentimental Miss Latterly, would never have owned. So who had? The question tugged at Pubright like a thread begging to be pulled. He decided the next person who might tug back was the lodger Miss Latterly had supposedly dismissed a month before her death, though such timelines, in Purbright's experience, were rarely accurate. He found Mr. Ambrose Wicketshaw at the library, where he was leafing through a gardening catalogue with earnest concentration. Mr. Wicketshaw, a thin man with spectacles far too large for his timid face, looked up with evident alarm as Pubright approached. "I hope I'm not intruding," Pubright said gently. "Oh, not at all, Inspector," Wicketshaw replied, though he immediately closed the catalogue as though caught reading something scandalous. Is this about poor Miss Latterly?" "In part," Pubright said, taking the opposite seat. "You lived with her for some time. I wondered if she ever mentioned family matters, old ones." Wicketshaw's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "Family? No, she wasn't." forthcoming about anything personal. Quite private, she was. Didn't like questions, didn't like surprises, didn't like, well, much of anything except order. Pubright nodded. Did she have any possessions she was particularly protective of? Oh, yes, Wicketshaw said, brightening slightly. A small wooden chest she kept in a locked drawer, said it contained sentimental nonsense she meant to burn eventually. And did she? I can't say. She never opened it in front of me. But she checked that drawer often, especially in the last month, as though she feared the chest might sprout legs and wander off. Pubright allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Did she ever show distress? Wicketshaw frowned. Once. She'd returned from visiting her sister, Mrs. Brotherton, I assume, and looked positively shaken, said old things have claws. I wasn't sure what she meant, so I pretended not to hear. Pubright thanked him and left, noting how the man's hands trembled when he mentioned old things. People in Flaxborough rarely feared the present. It was always the past that terrified them. The mention of the wooden chest drew him next to the one person who had seen more of Miss Latterly's belongings than anyone else, the retired midwife, Mrs. Edna Clavering, who lived in a small cottage overgrown with roses that had pretensions of swallowing the front path entirely. Mrs. Clavering opened her door with a look of vague amusement, as though expecting a visiting bishop or a lost salesman. "Inspector Pubright, come in, come in. Don't mind the roses. They've been plotting a coup for years." Pubright stepped inside the cluttered sitting room, nodding politely. He had always liked Mrs. Clavering's conversational style, brisk, humorous, and just evasive enough to suggest she knew precisely what not to say. "I wondered," he began, "whether you had visited Miss Latterly recently?" Mrs. Clavering tisked. "Visited only once, a fortnight before she passed. She wanted tincture advice and gossip, of course, though she pretended otherwise." "What sort of gossip?" "Oh, about her sister's family, about a niece who had inherited foolishness, about old mistakes. People do enjoy reviving old mistakes when their own lives are quiet." Pubright looked at her carefully. "Did she mention anything about a child?" Mrs. Clavering's knitting needle stopped mid-air, suspended between certainty and denial. "A child?" she repeated. "What an odd question." "Is it?" She resumed knitting with unnecessary vigour. "Inspector, many women of that generation had stories. Nothing criminal, just foolish choices made when they thought no one would know. But Miss Latterly never had children." "But she knew of some, perhaps?" Pubright suggested gently. Mrs. Clavering's lips pinched. "If she did, she never shared those details with me, and I've heard more confessions over the years than the vicar has." He sensed that was as far as her cooperation would go. She had not lied outright, but she had chosen her truths carefully. A woman like Mrs. Clavering never forgot anything, yet she had avoided acknowledging the cloth entirely, though he had never shown it. He thanked her and stepped outside. The roses rustled in the wind like gossiping old women who had seen a scandal decades ago and kept it safely wrapped in petals. Pubright walked slowly back toward the town centre, each clue settling into place like pieces of furniture in a sparsely furnished room. Miss Latterly had kept a chest of sentimental items she claimed to despise. She had been shaken by a visit to her sister. She had grown increasingly anxious in her final weeks. And the cloth, embroidered with tiny roses, had been hidden under her pillow, placed by someone who wanted it found or wanted it concealed. The niece had visited privately the night before the death. Mrs. Brotherton had withheld that fact. Miss Woodbriar feared old things, and the town itself churned rumours into nonsense, obscuring the fragile truth beneath. But it was the cloth's scent that returned to him now, weaving itself through his thoughts with stubborn persistence, lavender and cedar. Cedar used for drawers where delicate things were kept safe from moths. Cedar, the wood often chosen for cradles or keepsake boxes. Cedar, the smell of long-stored baby garments. Miss Latterly had said someone had been in her room. Someone had moved the pillow. Someone had placed or removed something connected to that embroidered scrap. Pubright returned to the station with a quiet certainty forming. The cloth was not merely sentimental. It was a surviving fragment of something someone did not wish remembered. He placed it carefully back into the envelope, but this time he did not close the drawer. Leaving it open, even a little, felt appropriate. After all, secrets shut away tended to grow restless. There remained one more person to speak with, one who had avoided him so far, though not through lack of opportunity. The niece. She had visited her aunt privately the evening before the older woman's death. She had said nothing since, and she had not yet been spoken to by anyone except, perhaps, her own conscience. Pubright rose from his chair with a slow, deliberate motion. The scrap lay waiting on the desk, pale and innocent as a child's forgotten treasure, a trivial object, and yet as he looked at it he knew it had already begun to unravel something far larger than a piece of lost embroidery. Inspector Pubright found the niece at the edge of the marketplace, standing before the greengrocer's stall with the tentative poise of someone who wished to be invisible but had never succeeded at it. She was small, fair-haired, and dressed plainly, though not without care. Her basket contained only a loaf of bread and 2 apples, as though she had purchased the bare minimum needed to justify being out at all. When Pubright approached, she startled, then tried to compose herself with a politeness that came too quickly to be natural. "Miss Evelyn Latterly?" Pubright asked gently. "Yes," she said, clutching the basket more tightly. I expect this is about Aunt Prudence." "About your visit to her," he clarified. Colour rose faintly in her cheeks. "I heard people were talking, but I didn't think it mattered. I was only there for a short while." "And yet Mrs. Brotherton didn't mention it," Pubright observed. Evelyn looked away, eyelids fluttering. "Aunt Adeline doesn't approve of me. She prefers not to acknowledge I exist at all except when I might cause embarrassment." "A common trait among relatives," Pubright said with mildness. "But I would appreciate your recollection of that evening." Evelyn hesitated, perhaps weighing how much to reveal, perhaps afraid of revealing too much. "She sent me a note," she finally murmured. "Aunt Prudence. It arrived that afternoon. She said she needed to speak with me privately, that it concerned things long past." Pubright waited, not intruding into her silence. "When I arrived," Evelyn continued, "she was sitting in her parlour with the curtains partly drawn. She looked frightened. I'd never seen her like that. She held a small box in her lap, a wooden one. It reminded me of something from my childhood, though I couldn't say why. She asked if I remembered a certain summer. I didn't. Or at least, I didn't understand what she meant. She became upset. She said she had done something unforgivable. Then she asked me to leave." "She dismissed you?" Pubright asked. "Yes, abruptly. She said she needed time to think before showing me what she intended, and that she wasn't sure I'd forgive her." Evelyn swallowed. "I thought she was ill, or perhaps confused. I told her I'd return the next day, but she was gone by morning." "You found nothing out of place?" Pubright said. "No, but she kept glancing toward her bedroom, as though she feared someone might go in after her, or had already been in." Pubright nodded, sensing that she had spoken honestly, though not exhaustively. There were still shadows behind her words. He thanked her gently and let her go. She left quickly as though eager to flee both him and the truth she had skirted. And yet he sensed she was less afraid of the police than of the memory her aunt had tried to unearth. As Pubright walked away, he saw another figure watching from a distance, Miss Woodbriar, arms folded, expression rigid. She turned sharply as soon as he noticed her. Her presence, always coincidental in appearance, never felt accidental. He decided it was time to untangle her part in this. The housekeeper answered her door with brisk irritation. "Inspector, I'm rather busy." "Miss Woodbriar," he said mildly, "you've been near at hand whenever the subject of Miss Latterly's final days arises. I wonder if there is something you fear I may find." Her expression flickered, first alarm, then indignation. "Fear? I've nothing to fear, Inspector." "Then you won't mind clarifying a few matters?" She stepped aside reluctantly. The parlour was as severe as Miss Latterly had been, neat lines, muted colours, and an air of disapproval toward anything resembling comfort. Miss Woodbriar did not invite him to sit, but Pubright did so anyway, choosing a chair that looked seldom used. "Miss Latterly owned a wooden chest," Pubright began, "one she checked often." Miss Woodbriar stiffened. "She had sentimental objects, old scraps mostly, nothing of importance." "She checked them often enough to worry her lodger," Pubright replied, "and enough to prompt a private meeting with her niece." Miss Woodbriar's hands tightened around each other. "If she chose to remember things best forgotten, that was her failing. I warned her once, told her it was foolish to stir up the past." Pubright tilted his head slightly. "Why did it concern you?" The housekeeper's eyes flashed briefly with something close to pain, swallowed almost immediately by defiance. "Because I cared for her," she said almost harshly. "I was the one who saw what those memories did to her. I was the one who had to fetch her smelling salts when she began trembling over events that happened before I was even born. She had been carrying something for years, Inspector, something heavy, and toward the end she couldn't keep the lid shut." "What was she carrying?" Pubright asked softly. Miss Woodbriar opened her mouth, closed it again. "Ask her sister," she snapped. "Mrs. Brotherton knows more about their past than anyone else, and she has always been determined to keep it clean." She ushered him toward the door, clearly unwilling to continue. Pubright stepped out onto the porch, watching the door close with soft finality. For the first time, Miss Woodbriar had revealed more truth in her silence than in her words. A secret shared between sisters, a secret resented by a housekeeper, a secret feared by a dying woman. Pubright walked slowly toward the vicarage next. The retired midwife, Mrs. Clavering, had seemed evasive, but the vicar himself might offer a different angle. He found Reverend Ashcombe trimming the hedge with excessive precision, as if each leaf were a moral failing in need of correction. "Inspector," the vicar greeted, "is this about Miss Latterly?" "In part. I'm tracing her final visitors and any confidences she may have shared." The vicar sighed. Miss Latterly was a complicated soul, always stern, always carrying a weight she would not name. She came to the church a few times these last months, not for prayer, I think, but for the silence. People come here sometimes when they're preparing themselves for something. What sort of something? Confession, perhaps. Cleansing. Or a final truth. Pubright nodded thoughtfully. "Did she speak with you?" "A little. She mentioned a mistake, a single mistake that haunted her life. She said she wished she had done right by the girl. I asked what girl she meant, but she only shook her head, said it would destroy her sister if the truth came out." Pubright felt the threads drawing tighter, weaving a shape whose outline began to emerge with quiet inevitability. a girl misplaced in the past, a secret held by two sisters, a wooden chest of sentimental objects, a niece who remembered nothing, a scrap of embroidered cloth, once part of a child's garment. "Did she ever mention her niece?" he asked. "Only that she regretted staying distant," the vicar replied. "She said affection is a plant that needs tending, and she had let it wither for too long." Pubright thanked him and walked on. By now, Flaxborough's streets were dimming into early evening. Lamps flickered on, windows glowed, and somewhere beneath the town's tidy surfaces pulsed a secret that had shaped the lives of two elderly sisters, one timid niece, a wary housekeeper, and a dead woman who sought at the last moment to reveal something she had buried. Pubright stopped at a bench near the square, letting the strands align gently. The embroidered roses were not random. They were a remnant of something Miss Latterly had kept locked away, a relic of a child's existence, one she had hidden, perhaps even relinquished. A child connected to either herself or someone she loved, a child whose memory was dangerous enough to frighten Mrs. Brotherton and to shake a dying woman into summoning a niece she had scarcely known. And yet the scrap had not been burned, nor discarded. Instead, someone had placed it beneath her pillow, to remind her, to confront her, or to silence her. The more Pubright considered it, the more certain he became. The web surrounding Miss Latterly's death had been spun long before she died. And somewhere in that tangle of old secrets, one thread had finally snapped free. He stood, brushing off his coat. There were still people he had not spoken to, people who had drifted quietly around the edges of the story, never stepping forward, but never quite absent. People with small grievances, old loyalties, and truths half forgotten. The night settled softly over Flaxborough as Pubright headed back toward the station, the embroidered scrap waiting in his drawer like a whisper from the past. A whisper that was growing louder. Inspector Pubright arrived at the station the next morning to find Constable Malley in a state of agitation typically reserved for escaped livestock or unexpected visits from counsellors. Malley hovered near the office door, hat in hand, eyes wide with the solemn gravity of someone bearing dire news. "Sir," he said, voice pitched low, something's happened at Miss Latterly's house." Pubright removed his coat without hurrying. "Something?" "A break-in, sir, or at least a disturbance. Miss Woodbriar found it when she arrived to tidy. Only one drawer was touched. The rest of the house is untouched." Pubright looked at him steadily. "Which drawer?" "The one in her bedroom, sir, the locked one." "Ah, the drawer with the sentimental chest." Pubright nodded once. "Let's go." Willow Lane was brisk with morning chill when they arrived. Miss Woodbriar stood rigidly in the doorway, her face set in lines of frantic self-control. She greeted Pubright with a jerky nod and ushered him inside, as though dragging him into a confession she did not want to make. "It was like this when I came in," she said, voice clipped. "I locked everything yesterday, every window, every door." "And yet," Pubright replied gently, "someone entered." She bristled but said nothing. They climbed the narrow stairs. At the top, the door of Miss Latterly's bedroom stood open, the room still unbearably neat except for the single drawer that had been pulled out and left hanging like a stunned jaw. Papers lay scattered across the carpet. The air carried a faint disturbance, as though someone had moved quickly and without care. Pubright knelt. Miss Latterly valued order. Whoever did this knew exactly which drawer to search. Miss Woodbriar's voice tightened further. "The chest is gone." "Gone?" Malley echoed. "Taken," she clarified. "The small cedar one. I've looked everywhere." Pubright closed his eyes briefly. Cedar, the scent on the cloth. He picked up a sheet of paper from the floor, one corner torn, a list of household expenses, nothing of note. Someone had been searching hastily, ruthlessly, for something specific. "When did you last see the chest?" Pubright asked. "The day she died," Miss Woodbriar replied, trembling despite her attempt at composure. "It was in the locked drawer. She always kept it there. I never touched it." "Has Mrs. Brotherton been here?" Pubright asked, calmly. Miss Woodbriar hesitated a heartbeat too long. I don't know. She has keys to the back door." Pubright gave her a mild, unreadable look. "Yet you didn't mention that." Miss Woodbriar flushed. "She said she wouldn't come, and she wouldn't do this." Pubright offered no reassurance. He stepped toward the drawer, examining the lock. It had not been forced. Someone had used a key or skill. The fact that nothing else had been disturbed suggested the intruder wanted only one thing: the contents of that cedar box. "What was in it?" Pubright asked quietly. Miss Woodbriar stared at the floor. "Old keepsakes, things from long ago. She told me once it held things she wished she could forget." "Which means," Pubright said, straightening, "someone else wished to forget them even more." Miss Woodbriar's eyes flashed with an emotion sharper than fear. "I'm telling you, Inspector, there are things in that family best left alone." Pubright gave her a gentle nod, which is why they refused to stay buried. Back downstairs, Mrs. Brotherton herself arrived, breathless and dishevelled, in a way wholly inconsistent with her usual polished appearance. She looked from Miss Woodbriar to Pubright with sharp appraisal. "I heard there has been vandalism," she said, tone clipped. Pubright regarded her calmly. "A drawer has been searched. A box is missing." Mrs. Brotherton's face froze, not dramatically, but with the subtle rigidity of porcelain beginning to crack. "What box?" "Your sister kept a cedar chest," Pubright said, "sentimental in nature." "I know nothing about it," she replied too quickly. "Prudence never trusted me with personal matters." Pubright watched her eyes flick toward the stairs, flick back just as swiftly. He did not accuse her. He merely allowed silence to stretch the way one allows a door to open naturally under its own weight. Mrs. Brotherton swallowed. "My sister's affairs are private. I hope you intend to keep this burglary discreet." "When discretion is possible," Pubright replied. She bristled. Some things were already unpleasant enough without the police stirring them up. "That sentiment," Pubright said gently, "was shared by your sister. That struck something." Mrs. Brotherton stiffened, lips tightening with a pain she attempted to disguise as indignation. "Inspector, I will not have the past dragged through the streets." Pubright nodded courteously. "Then perhaps it ought not to have been dragged from the drawer." She flinched and turned away. After she left, Mally turned to Pubright, baffled. "Sir, do you think she took the box?" Pubright shook his head. "I think she is afraid of what was inside it. That is not the same thing as theft." "Then who would want it?" Mally asked. Purbright's gaze settled on the empty space in the drawer. Someone who feared what Miss Latterly finally intended to reveal. He walked slowly through the house, allowing the room to speak. Everything remained in unnatural order, except that one drawer, a surgical incision into the past. Whoever had done it had moved with urgency, perhaps even desperation. As he left the house, he noticed something small near the hedge, a thread of pale pink caught on a branch. He plucked it gently. Embroidery thread, the same shade as the faded roses on the scrap. The intruder had been hurried and careless. Back at the station, Pubright placed the thread beside the embroidered scrap. The colours matched almost perfectly. Though the scrap had faded, the thread hinted at what it once had been. Someone had handled cloth from the same origin very recently. Someone who still possessed the rest of it, or pieces of it. Someone who had removed the cedar chest because its contents threatened something long concealed. Pubright folded the thread neatly and placed it beside the envelope. The town buzzed outside, markets rustling, gossip stirring anew. The second incident had begun weaving its own distortions, stories of thieves, secret wills, hidden fortunes. But Pubright ignored the noise. The true motive was older, quieter, and far more human. Fear guided the intruder. Fear guided Mrs. Brotherton. Fear guided Miss Woodbriar. But fear of what? The embroidered scrap was not a threat by itself. Only the truth attached to it was dangerous. As evening crept over Flaxborough, Pubright leaned back, closing his eyes. The past was drawing nearer, no longer content to be stored away in cedar and lavender. Someone had tried to destroy it. Someone else had tried to reveal it. And now the two forces nudged at each other through cracked drawers and whispered visits. The thread in his hand, faint and delicate, connected them all. The past had chosen its moment to rise, and Pubright intended to follow it to the source. Inspector Pubright remained at his desk long after Constable Malley had retired to the front office, long after the station's kettle had finished wheezing its final sigh of steam, long after the street outside had settled into its evening hush. Flaxborough rarely grew loud, even on its most excitable days. The town preferred its upheavals quiet, and its scandals whispered rather than shouted. But tonight, beneath the surface, he sensed a deeper tremor, a faint, persistent strain, humming like tension on a violin string. The embroidered scrap rested before him, the small pink roses subdued by age, but not erased. Beside it, the thread he had collected from the hedge glowed faintly in the lamplight, a tiny witness to hurried hands and nervous intentions. Pubright studied the two fragments, allowing his thoughts to settle into the rhythm of observation rather than deduction. There was a difference, and he preferred not to rush the latter. Someone had slipped into Miss Latterly's house, used a key or a steady hand, ignored the valuables, and made straight for the drawer she guarded most. They had rifled through it with urgency, taken the cedar chest and fled. Not to steal, but to erase, to blot out something Miss Latterly had intended to reveal. What struck Pubright most was not the theft itself, but the timing. If the box contained secrets from decades past, why remove it only after her death? Why not while she lived, when the risk of discovery might have been greater? Unless, the thought unfolded softly, Miss Latterly herself had signalled that the past would no longer remain quiet. He leaned back in his chair, letting the room's dimness grow companionable. People did not fear the present, not truly. It was the past that slipped through cracks, returning with the persistence of damp. The past held the power to unmake reputations, unsettle families, and disturb arrangements carefully tended for years. Mrs. Brotherton's reaction had been the most telling. Her brittle command that the matter be kept discreet, her unconvincing ignorance of the cedar chest, her insistence that some things should not be dug up. These were the instincts of someone not merely embarrassed, but frightened. And Miss Woodbriar's nervous allegiance to silence had been equally compelling. Housekeepers always knew more than they said, but few guarded secrets that didn't belong to them. Her fierce protectiveness suggested she felt implicated, not in guilt, perhaps, but in loyalty. Pubright tapped one finger against the envelope. Miss Latterly's niece, Evelyn, however, had shown neither avoidance nor guilt, only confusion, and a grief that seemed uncomplicated by deception. She had known nothing, or believed she knew nothing. Yet Miss Latterly had called her specifically the night before her death. Called her to confess, called her to reveal a connection between them that Evelyn had never suspected, a connection that frightened Mrs. Brotherton, a connection that made Miss Latterly tremble when she checked her drawer, a connection someone wanted erased. He rose from his chair and moved to the office window. Outside, the street lamps glowed with the faint orange haze that dimly lit the cobblestones. A figure crossed the square in the distance, small, hurried, clutching a parcel to her chest. He thought for a moment it might be the niece. Then the figure turned toward the high street and vanished. Purbright's reflection in the window looked back at him, calm, composed, perhaps too still. A policeman's face, but not a predator's. He disliked pouncing, far better to wait until the truth showed itself, weary from hiding. He returned to his chair, drawing out his notebook. Not for written conclusions, he rarely relied on those, but to anchor passing thoughts before sleep stole them away. Miss Latterly, frightened, regretful, protective of something in the cedar chest. Mrs. Brotherton, adamant that the chest never see daylight, terrified of stains on the family name. Miss Woodbriar, loyal but uneasy, aware of something unspoken. Evelyn, unknowing but central. Unknown visitor in the house before the death and again after, searching. Pubright closed the notebook and set it aside. He imagined Miss Latterly alone in her room that final night, the cedar chest on her lap, fingering the embroidered cloth while mustering the courage to do what she had postponed for decades. He imagined her hearing a footstep or a floorboard creaking. He imagined the pillow disturbed, either by her own trembling hands or by another's. And he imagined her deciding at last to call her niece. The past had pressed itself against her conscience long enough, but someone else had been listening. He stood, stretching, and moved toward the coat rack. The night was young enough for a walk. The air in Flaxborough often loosened knots in the mind. Its tidy quietness offered contrast to the tangle of human motives. He stepped out onto the pavement, passing the dim bakery, the shuttered grocers, the post office with its faint smell of sorting ink. His steps took him down the lane toward Willow Lane, almost of their own accord. Miss Latterly's house sat in its usual dignified gloom, the curtains drawn tight as though the house itself feared scrutiny. A faint light glimmered inside, Miss Woodbriar perhaps unable to stay away even after hours. Pubright lingered by the gate, not to intrude, but to observe. The front hedge rustled quietly in the breeze, its leaves whispering like conspirators. Somewhere behind a shuttered window, a shape moved, a shadow crossing a room that should have been empty. He listened. No footsteps, no voices, just the soft creak of old timber adjusting to night's coolness. He moved on, unwilling to make assumptions on the basis of shadows. Instead, he walked toward the vicarage. Reverend Ashcombe's study lamp still burned. The vicar was a man of habit, sorting sermon notes at the same hour each week. Pubright paused under the archway of the gate, but did not knock. The vicar had already given him the peace he needed. Miss Latterly had spoken of a girl she wished she'd done right by. He thought again of Evelyn, the niece. The woman carried no sign of resentment or estrangement, yet Miss Latterly's remorse had been unmistakable. Remorse, not for wronging Evelyn, but for wronging the girl. Could they be the same? Or was there another? He resumed his walk, letting the cool air sharpen his thoughts. Flaxborough's past was not exceptional in its dramas, merely quieter, buried under respectability and lavender-scented propriety. But he sensed that Miss Latterly's secret was not a crime. It was something gentler, though no less consequential, something born from emotion rather than malice. A birth, perhaps, or a child misplaced, or a decision made in desperation and regretted for a lifetime. The cedar chest had held evidence. The embroidered scrap was only the first whisper. Someone had wanted the box destroyed. Someone who feared what Miss Latterly finally intended, and yet someone else before the robbery had placed the scrap under the pillow, not to hide, but to remind, to prompt, to urge, two forces working at cross purposes. He returned to the station with the certainty that the past was not a single event, but a web. Threads connecting Miss Latterly, Mrs. Brotherton, Miss Woodbriar, and perhaps even the vicar's assistant or the lodger in ways none wished to articulate. The faint clatter of Mally sorting paperwork filtered through the door. Pubright set the embroidered scraps back into their envelope, not hiding them deep in the drawer this time, but keeping them close. The remnants of the past had grown bold enough to enter Miss Latterly's bedroom. He suspected they would soon step into the present more directly. He extinguished the lamp and sat for a moment in the half-light of the street lamp outside. Fear, he thought, was the quietest of motives, but also the strongest. People could endure the truth for decades, provided no one else knew it. But the moment truth threatened to become shared, fear sharpened into action. The drawer's lock, the missing cedar chest, the thread on the hedge. Someone had acted from fear. And when fear acted once, it rarely stopped. Inspector Pubright arrived early the following morning, earlier than even the milkman's reluctant clatter along the cobblestones. The station was quiet, dimly lit, and pleasantly cold, conditions that suited reflection. But today was not for reflection alone. Today was for something else, a polite, harmless conversation that would not feel harmless at all to the person who sat across from him. The embroidered scrap lay in its envelope on his desk, its thread companion beside it. Pubright did not look at them now. The time for looking had passed. What mattered was movement, small, careful, conversational movement that would guide a guilty conscience into revealing itself without ever being accused. He informed Constable Mally, who was swallowing tea far too hot for his constitution. "We'll need to send for 3 individuals this morning. Kindly invite them, without urgency, if you please." "Who, sir?" "Mrs. Brotherton, Miss Woodbriar, and Miss Evelyn Latterly." Mally blinked at the trio. "All at once, sir?" "No," Pubright said mildly. "Separately and politely, a matter of clarifying records, you may tell them." Mally nodded, relieved by the absence of dramatic phrasing, and set off. Pubright prepared the interview room, not by arranging files or laying out evidence, but by removing everything but 2 chairs and a small table. The room felt almost pastoral in its plainness, which was precisely the point. People said far more in empty rooms. The first to arrive was Miss Woodbriar. She entered stiffly, clasping her hands so tightly the knuckles turned pale. Pubright welcomed her with soft courtesy and gestured to the chair opposite him. "You mentioned once," he began, after offering her tea he knew she would refuse, "that Miss Latterly was troubled by memories, that she feared the past. I wondered if you might help me understand what made her so, what was your word, unsettled." Miss Woodbriar's throat moved in a nervous swallow. "I've told you everything I know." Purbright's tone remained gentle. "Have you?" She blinked, startled. "Yes, I mean, what else could there be?" "She was an anxious old woman, that's all." Pubright didn't challenge the statement. He merely added, "You were very protective of her. You still are." Colour rose sharply in her cheeks. "Someone had to be." Mrs. Brotherton cared more about preserving respectability than her sister's happiness. "Ah," Pubright murmured. "Yet when Miss Latterly called her niece the night before her death,
You didn't mention it. You also didn't mention that Mrs. Brotherton had a key to the house. Miss Woodbriar stiffened. Why should I? It proved nothing. On the contrary, Pubright said, it proved there were others who might enter quietly, others who might know the location of the cedar chest. Her breath hitched slightly, a small sound but unmistakable. Pubright leaned back, expression serene. You see, Miss Woodbriar, someone entered that house after Miss Latterly died. Someone who knew where the chest was, someone who wanted its contents gone. She stared ahead, frozen. You think it was me? I have thought nothing, he replied, voice calm as snowfall. I merely observe that devotion sometimes compels people to act in ways they later regret. A tremor ran through her shoulders, brief but violent. I didn't take it, she whispered. I didn't. I only wanted her to forget it existed. Pubright did not push her further. He let her go, excusing her with a nod. She left in a flurry of shaking breath, her composure shattered not by accusation, but by the realization that he understood far more than she wished anyone to know. The second visitor arrived with the force of a gusting wind. Mrs. Brotherton swept into the station as though attending an unwelcome yet obligatory ceremony. Her coat was wrapped tightly around her, her hat pinned severely, her lips pressed into their familiar expression of reproach. Inspector, she said sharply, sitting before being invited, I was told you require clarification. Only a small matter, Pubright said with infuriating mildness. Your sister kept a cedar chest. Sentimental items, you never mentioned it. I had no knowledge of such a thing. Pubright nodded. A drawer in her bedroom was searched. The chest is missing. I know nothing about it, she repeated coolly. Of course, Pubright said. May I ask why you also did not mention that her niece visited her the night before she died? Mrs. Brotherton's jaw tightened. Because it was unimportant. Your
sister thought otherwise, Pubright replied. She sent for her. She wished to confess something she feared would cause distress. A flicker crossed Mrs. Brotherton's face, brief, brittle, unguarded. She folded her hands so tightly her rings pressed into her skin. My sister was always prone to dramatics in old age, she said. And yet she wasn't dramatic, Pubright said with a softness sharpened by precision. She was frightened, remorseful, and she wished to finally tell the truth. But someone prevented that truth from emerging. Mrs. Brotherton held herself as though bracing for a storm. Inspector, I have endured quite enough insinuations. My sister is dead. I will not tolerate her name being dragged through idle speculation. Pubright nodded again. We agree then. Truth is rarely idle. That was all. He dismissed her with a courteous smile, and she departed, dignity wrapped around her like armor, though cracks were beginning to show. The last visitor entered quietly, Evelyn Latterly looking smaller than before, as though the town's whispers and her own unanswered questions had worn her down. She sat delicately, her fingers knotted together. I hope I'm not in trouble, she said softly. Not in the slightest, Pubright said. I wish to ask about the box your aunt held when you visited. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. I knew you'd ask again. She inhaled. She opened it while I was there, only for a moment. I saw pieces of fabric, letters, something wrapped in ribbon. She said they were mistakes. Pubright listened without interrupting. She told me she should have told me everything years ago that I had a right to know. I thought she meant some family disagreement. I never imagined it was anything important. What do you think it was? He asked gently. Evelyn shook her head helplessly. I don't know, but she kept saying, Your mother was so young, she didn't understand. I did what I thought was best. My mother died when I was a baby, Inspector. I never knew her. Pubright absorbed this carefully. Did she mention whom she feared? No, Evelyn whispered. Only that she feared it was too late to tell the truth. Too late to make it right. Pubright dismissed her kindly. She rose slowly, leaving behind a lingering sadness that felt oddly central, not to guilt, but to the heart of the original secret. When she was gone, Pubright sat in silence, letting the conversation settle. Miss Woodbriar, protective, not guilty, but complicit in silence. Mrs. Brotherton, terrified of disgrace, too frightened to let old truths breathe. Evelyn, innocent, yet somehow at the centre of the past Miss Latterly had feared. None of them had taken the cedar chest, but one of them knew who had, or at the very least, what was inside. Pubright reached for the envelope. He spread the embroidery and the thread side by side. The trap had not been for confessions. Those rarely came clean. The trap had been for reactions, subtle and involuntary, those tiny slips of fear that revealed who still felt the tug of the buried past. He had seen enough. The real owner of the cedar chest, before Miss Latterly had taken possession of it, had not been any of the women who visited him today. It belonged to someone who had not yet been summoned, someone who had stayed conveniently quiet, someone who had more to lose than reputation. Pubright closed the envelope with care. The trap had been set. It had already sprung. Now he merely needed to follow the line of fear to its inevitable end. Inspector Pubright chose the setting with intentional calm. Mrs. Brotherton's drawing-room, a place so formal and stiff-backed that truth, any truth, would stand out like a misplaced teacup. Heavy curtains muted the light, porcelain figurines stared down the room with the same judgment its owner so often exercised. Mrs. Brotherton sat rigidly in one of her armchairs, hands folded over a handkerchief as though preparing herself to preside over an unpleasant committee ruling. Miss Woodbriar hovered by the fireplace, pale and tense, while Evelyn Latterly sat near the window, twisting her gloves in her hands. Pubright stood not as a lecturer, but as a host, guiding reluctant guests through a delicate conversation. He allowed a courteous silence before he began. "I appreciate you all coming," he said. "I believe we are close to understanding the nature of Miss Latterly's distress, and, by extension, the events of the past few days." Mrs. Brotherton sniffed. "I do hope, Inspector, that this will put an end to the unnecessary rumours." Pubright inclined his head. "It will. The truth generally has that effect even when people dread it." A flicker of discomfort crossed both her face and Miss Woodbriar's. Pubright reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the envelope containing the embroidered scrap. He laid it gently on the table between them. "This," he said, "is the piece of cloth placed beneath your sister's pillow." Mrs. Brotherton's chin lifted sharply, as though the sight of the scrap itself were an intrusion. Pubright continued softly. "It was not random. It was once part of a child's garment, embroidered by hand, lavender-scented, and stored for years in a cedar chest your sister kept locked away." Evelyn's breath caught faintly, while Miss Woodbriar looked at the cloth with an expression that betrayed both recognition and dread. Pubright went on, his tone calm, measured. "Your sister, Mrs. Brotherton, was tormented in her final days by something she called a mistake involving a girl, a child. She feared the truth coming out, yet she also wished to confess. That conflict consumed her." Mrs. Brotherton stiffened. "My sister was, emotional. Old age plays tricks on clarity." Pubright regarded her gently. "Perhaps, but this particular trick had been haunting her for more than 40 years. The room stilled. Pubright shifted his gaze toward Evelyn. "Your aunt summoned you the night before her death, She opened the cedar chest. You saw letters, fabric, a ribbon. Evelyn nodded, voice faint. Yes. She said she should have told me, but I didn't understand what she meant. Pubright folded his hands before him. Miss Latterly was not referring to a quarrel or a petty family secret. She was referring to a child, a baby born long ago whose existence was concealed. Mrs. Brotherton's handkerchief slipped from her fingers. Purbright's tone remained compassionate. The child was not Miss Latterly's, it was her sister's. Evelyn blinked, stunned. My mother? But my mother died when I was an infant. She never spoke of... She could not, Purbright said softly. Your mother was very young when she became pregnant. Too young in the eyes of the family. To avoid scandal, the infant was hidden, placed temporarily with arrangements meant to be discreet. Miss Latterly handled much of it. She was the practical one, the organized one, but she regretted the deception for the rest of her life. Mrs. Brotherton's composure cracked like a fragile shell. Inspector Pubright, this is outrageous, Pubright continued gently. Your sister kept the embroidered scrap because it was part of the baby's clothing, a memento she could not bear to destroy, though she hid it. The cedar chest held all the remnants of that secret, the garment, the letters, the records, the truth. Evelyn stared at him, confusion giving way to something heavier, something like grief, mixed with unexpected recognition. Then, the child, who was she? Pubright looked at her with quiet kindness. You, Miss Evelyn? A soft gasp escaped her. She pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Purbright's voice remained steady. Your mother died soon after giving birth. The arrangements to conceal the pregnancy became entangled in guilt and silence. Miss Latterly regretted not doing more. She wished to tell you. She wished to explain that the coldness you felt from her was not disdain, but fear that you would hate her for her part in your concealment. Evelyn closed her eyes, tears slipping silently. Mrs. Brotherton rose abruptly. Inspector, enough! You know nothing of what our family endured. My sister and I acted in the only way respectable society allowed. It was necessary. It was decent. Pubright looked at her without accusation. Respectability, Mrs. Brotherton, is often a shield polished so brightly it blinds its owner. Your sister lived in regret, and the moment she resolved to tell the truth, someone removed her cedar chest. Miss Woodbriar flinched. Pubright turned to her gently. Miss Woodbriar, you didn't steal it, but you knew who did. Tears trembled in the woman's eyes. I didn't want to betray her. You served Miss
Latterly faithfully for many years, Pubright said softly. You loved her in your way, and you knew she was planning to reveal the truth. But someone else, someone more frightened than remorseful, acted first. Mrs. Brotherton's voice broke. I didn't steal anything. No, Pubright said reassuringly. You didn't enter the house, but you asked someone to. Someone frightened, loyal, and desperate to protect both you and the family name. Miss Woodbriar collapsed into the nearest chair, covering her face. I only wanted to help, she whispered. She told me stories, told me things when she had her spells, and Mrs. Brotherton said it was better not to let those memories trouble her. She said it would destroy everything if Evelyn learned the truth. Pubright nodded slowly. So Miss Woodbriar, believing she was protecting not only the family but Miss Latterly herself, used the back door key and removed the cedar chest. She scattered the papers, took the box, and intended to burn it. Miss Woodbriar sobbed softly. I didn't want her to die with shame. I didn't want Evelyn to suffer the gossip. I didn't want... Mrs. Brotherton's voice cut through, trembling, half-whispered. You should have left it alone, Edith. It was the first time she had spoken Miss Woodbriar's name with softness rather than command. Evelyn looked up, tears still on her cheeks. "I never would have hated her," she whispered. "Or you. I only wanted to understand why she looked at me that way, why she seemed afraid of me." Purbright's eyes warmed. "Fear, Miss Evelyn, makes people behave strangely. But your aunt summoned you because she no longer wished to be afraid. She wished, at last, to do right by you." The room was silent, except for Miss Woodbriar's quiet sobs and Mrs. Brotherton's trembling breaths. Purbright gathered the envelope gently. "The cedar chest may be gone, but its truth remains. It cannot harm you now, unless you continue to fear it." Mrs. Brotherton lowered herself onto the sofa, posture softened, dignity shaken, but not shattered. "I only wanted to protect our name," she murmured. "You protected it so well," Purbright said kindly, "that you buried a part of your family with it." For the first time, Mrs. Brotherton looked at Evelyn not with polite dismissal, but something more vulnerable, something like recognition. Miss Woodbriar wiped her eyes. "Will I be punished, Inspector?" Purbright shook his head gently. No harm was intended, nor was anything of value taken. What was done out of misplaced loyalty, not malice. Miss Woodbriar broke into relieved tears. Purbright allowed the room a final quiet. The truth had been laid out, not loudly, not cruelly, but with the gentle inevitability of dawn. He gathered his hat from the armchair. "I believe my work here is done." As he stepped toward the door, he glanced back. Mrs. Brotherton, for once,
did not look rigid. Miss Woodbriar leaned against the mantel, drained but honest. Evelyn sat with the embroidered scrap in her hands, touching it as if it were the first fragment of herself she had ever truly known. The truth, Purbright reflected, had not shattered the room. It had simply rearranged it. Inspector Pubright left Mrs. Brotherton's house with the same unhurried steps with which he had entered, though the air felt distinctly lighter now that the room behind him had been emptied of its long suppressed truths. The afternoon sun cast a pale glow across Willow Lane, softening the edges of the neat hedges and prim lace curtains, as though the town itself had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. Secrets had weight, and Flaxborough, quiet, respectable, fond of tidy fronts, had been carrying one that had finally begun to settle. He walked without hurry, hands clasped loosely behind him, absorbing the gentle hush that followed a truth revealed rather than a crime avenged. The streets did not know yet, of course. Gossip travelled swiftly, but it was also selective. The embroidered scrap beneath a pillow, the cedar chest, and the child once hidden beneath propriety's rug. These things would never make it into Flaxborough's more colourful rumours. They weren't scandalous in a way the town enjoyed. They were too human, too soft at the edges. As he passed the baker's, Mr. Daggett gave him a nod weighted with curiosity. Pubright returned it with a mild smile, offering nothing more. The baker's imagination, left without fuel, would soon wander back to the far more poetic idea of secret wills or coded messages. This suited Pubright just fine. He turned toward the churchyard, not out of duty but instinct. Reverend Ashcombe was trimming the winter-worn edges of the flower beds, humming faintly. The vicar always hummed when something in town had resolved itself, the faintest liturgical sign of satisfied peace. "Inspector?" Ashcombe greeted warmly. "You look as though a burden's lifted." "Truth tends to lighten the air," Pubright replied. The vicar nodded, knowingly. "And does Miss Latterly rest easier now, do you think?" "I imagine she does," Pubright said. "Much of her sorrow lay in the telling, not the deed." Ashcombe paused in his trimming. "And the living?" Pubright considered this. The living will adjust, some quicker than others. He did not elaborate. The vicar, wise enough to recognize the boundaries of a concluded matter, returned to his trimming with a gentle hum. Pubright continued on, allowing his mind to drift, not to the investigation itself, which was now tidily folded away, but to the people left standing after it. Evelyn Latterly discovering her place in the world anew. Miss Woodbriar, shaken but relieved to learn her misguided loyalty would not destroy her. And Mrs. Brotherton, her stiff posture finally bent under the weight of a truth she had spent most of her life refusing to face. He imagined the three women now, still gathered in that drawing-room like figures released from rigid poses. Mrs. Brotherton would be straightening her handkerchief again, saying very little but thinking very much. Miss Woodbriar, steadier now, would be offering Evelyn tea in the hopeful, apologetic way of someone eager to repair what she feared she had broken. And Evelyn, not quite smiling yet, but no longer trembling, would be turning the embroidered scrap in her hands, tracing its faded roses as though touching a lineage she had never known she carried. He walked past the library next, where Mr. Wicketshaw peered over the top of a newspaper with his usual mixture of dread and curiosity. "Morning, Inspector," he called, then faltered as though reconsidering whether he wanted to ask the question beneath his breath. Pubright spared him the trouble. "All is well, Mr. Wicketshaw." "Oh, good, good." The lodger dipped behind his newspaper with visible relief. Pubright moved on toward the marketplace, where the mild bustle of townspeople collecting vegetables and exchanging small, inconsequential gossip floated in the cool breeze. The rumours about Miss Latterly had already shifted, he could tell. Mrs. Harmston was confidently telling Miss Pulteney that the police had discovered a coded affair letter from the 1920s. Another woman insisted there had been a misplaced will hidden in a hymn book. A young lad bragged that the inspector had told him someone buried treasure in the garden. Pubright suspected the boy would publish a map within a week. He let them talk. Truth, he had long understood, was rarely the preferred version of events. It lacked the sparkle of invention. It was not dramatic enough to retell. And so the real story, the one involving shame, remorse, and a child concealed for propriety's sake, would remain safely tucked between those who lived it. He had no desire to feed Flaxborough's appetite for embellishment. By the time he reached the station again, he felt the faint warmth of accomplishment, not pride exactly, but satisfaction in seeing a delicate matter resolved without the need for handcuffs or headlines. Constable Malley looked up eagerly as he entered. "All sorted, sir?" Malley asked, teacup halfway to his lips. "Yes, thank you," Pubright said, removing his coat. "All sorted." Malley hesitated. "Will there be reports to file? Statements? Charges?" Pubright shook his head, easing himself into his chair. "Just a brief note, no charges." Malley blinked, disappointed by the lack of scandal. "Oh, I see. Quiet ending, then?" Pubright allowed himself a faint smile. "Most endings worth having are." He opened a fresh file, though only out of habit. He would not need more than a page for this one. He wrote succinctly, as always, "Disturbance at residence of late Miss Prudence Latterly." No criminal intent. No loss of value. Matter resolved through private family reconciliation. He paused, then added, "Recommend no further inquiry." He closed the file gently, as though laying a coverlet over a sleeping child. Outside, the weak sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, touching the edge of the embroidered scrap still in his pocket. He took it out, gazing at the delicate roses. It no longer held mystery, only a quiet significance, a surviving fragment of a life that had been set right just in time. Pubright debated whether to return it to Evelyn or keep it until she asked. In the end, he slipped it into a small envelope addressed to her and set it on the outgoing tray. She would understand its meaning more fully now. He leaned back, letting the calm of the station seep into him. The kettle whistled in the other room. Mally muttered faintly as he tried to balance forms with the minimal competence he possessed. The ordinary rhythm of Flaxborough life resumed, steady, undramatic, mildly confused. As Pubright closed his eyes for a moment's rest, he felt that subtle satisfaction again, the kind that came not from solving a crime, but from untangling humanity. No arrests, no headlines, no glory, only restored peace. And in Flaxborough, restored peace was more valuable than justice shouted from rooftops. He opened his eyes, straightened the papers on his desk, and reached for his next stack of minor reports. Noise complaints, a dispute over garden boundaries, and a request from Councillor Peel for inspection of street lamps, a return to normality, a return to quiet, a return to the gentle, undisturbed pace of a town that preferred its scandals faint and its truths whispered. Inspector Pubright picked up his pen. All was as it should be again.